Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The journey begins. The Johnson family stepped onto the jet bridge, their excitement palpable as they made their way toward the gleaming aircraft. The anticipation of their first ever flight in first class had been building for months, and now it was finally time. Marcus, the father, adjusted his crisp navy suit, running his hand over the fabric to smooth any wrinkles. Amelia, his wife, lovingly smoothed down her emerald green dress, the elegant fabric hugging her frame in just the right way. Their children, Zoe and Tyler, aged 12 and 9, practically bounced beside them, their eyes wide with wonder as they took in every detail of their surroundings. They had never imagined such luxury, and it was all for them. "This is really happening," Zoe whispered to her brother as they walked. Tyler, his small hand in his sister's, nodded excitedly, his face alight with pure joy. "First class, Zoe. First class." Their parents shared a smile, exchanging a look that spoke volumes, a mixture of pride, gratitude, and relief. This moment was a culmination of years of hard work, sacrifices, and countless hours spent building their careers. Marcus had always wanted to give his family the best, and now, after months of careful saving and planning, they were about to experience something extraordinary. As they entered the plane, the luxurious interior of the first-class cabin greeted them like a dream. Plush leather seats with ample legroom, soft lighting that created a calm ambience, and an attentive crew ready to cater to their every need. Amelia guided the children to their seats, a private section of the cabin with ample space. Zoe's eyes scanned the room, her gaze lingering on the gourmet meals displayed on the menu at each seat. "Look at all the food choices." Zoe gasped. "I can order anything?" Tyler bounced in his seat. "And we get our own TV screens." Amelia's heart swelled as she watched their excitement grow. She felt the weight of this moment, their first flight together as a family, and the joy that came with the realization that they had earned it. She squeezed Marcus's hand as they settled in, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "You did it, Marcus," she whispered, her voice full of pride. Marcus smiled at her, a deep sense of satisfaction filling his chest. "We did it," he replied softly, the love he felt for his family evident in every word. Every moment of it. As the family settled into their seats, their excitement was contagious. Zoe and Tyler marveled at the state-of-the-art entertainment systems in front of them, already flipping through the options of movies and games available at their fingertips. Amelia gazed out the window, her thoughts turning to the journey ahead. The trip to the Bahamas had been a dream they had shared for years. Now, it was becoming a reality. But as the family laughed and talked, an uneasy feeling began to creep into Amelia's chest. She couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. A few passengers were casting curious glances their way, some even staring for a little too long. She noticed the looks from the corners of her eyes but tried to ignore them, attributing them to the usual fascination that came with seeing a family like hers, black, successful, and stepping into an environment where they were often invisible. Still, the discomfort lingered. Amelia's grip on the armrest tightened, and she forced herself to focus on the excitement of the moment, hoping the unease would pass. Marcus, ever observant, caught the eye of an older gentleman sitting across the aisle. The man's gaze was brief, but the hesitation was enough for Marcus to notice. The man quickly turned away, focusing on his newspaper with exaggerated interest, but Marcus had already seen the subtle shift in his expression, a look of surprise and suspicion that he had encountered many times before in his career as a corporate lawyer. It was the same look he'd seen from colleagues, acquaintances, even strangers, people who couldn't quite reconcile the idea of a successful black family in a space traditionally reserved for the wealthy and influential. He sighed inwardly but refused to let it spoil the moment. His family had earned this seat, this flight, and this experience. He wasn't going to let the prejudice of others dictate their enjoyment. "Marcus, do you think they'll be okay?" Amelia's voice broke through his thoughts. She was looking down the aisle, a worried frown creasing her brow. "They're fine," Marcus said, his tone reassuring. "Zoe and Tyler are having the time of their lives, and so are we." Let's just enjoy the moment. Amelia nodded, though the unease hadn't entirely left her. She turned her attention back to the children, who were now fully immersed in the luxury of their surroundings. Zoe and Tyler were laughing and pointing at the various entertainment options, their joy infectious. The pre-flight routine began as the attendants moved through the cabin, checking seat belts and overhead compartments, ensuring everything was in order for takeoff. One attendant, a young woman with blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun, approached their row. Her smile was professional, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good afternoon," she said in a voice that was polite, but lacked warmth. "May I see your boarding passes?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, but his instincts told him to stay calm. This wasn't unusual, attendants always asked for tickets before takeoff. But there was something about the way the woman was looking at them, as though she were examining them too closely. He handed over the 4 tickets, watching as she studied them intently, her brow furrowing slightly. She glanced at the family, then back at the tickets. Marcus felt a flicker of unease in his stomach. It was subtle, but it was there. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone even, though a hint of suspicion entered his voice. The attendant hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously between the family and the tickets before she finally spoke. "I'll need to check something with my supervisor," she said, her voice slightly shaky. "Please excuse me for a moment." Amelia and Marcus exchanged worried glances as the attendant walked away, her footsteps echoing in the quiet cabin. Time seemed to slow. The children, blissfully unaware of the growing tension, continued to marvel at the cabin's amenities, but Marcus and Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every glance, every pause, every whisper in the air seemed to be building up to something. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like an eternity. Other passengers boarded, some casting curious looks toward the Johnsons, others whispering among themselves. Amelia felt her heart rate quicken, and a knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. Was it really just curiosity, or was there something more to these glances? Something they couldn't quite place. Finally, the attendant returned. This time, she was accompanied by an older man, graying hair, a stern expression, and a name tag that read Mr. Dawson, head flight attendant. His presence was commanding, and the tension in the air intensified immediately. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," Mr. Dawson began, his voice low but firm, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding with your seating assignment. We'll need to move you to the economy section." Marcus felt a flash of anger surge within him, but he kept his composure. "I'm sorry, but there's no misunderstanding. We booked and paid for these first-class seats months ago. May I ask why we're being asked to move?" Mr. Dawson shifted uncomfortably under Marcus's gaze, his eyes flicking nervously. "There seems to have been an overbooking issue," he explained, his voice faltering. "We need these seats for other passengers." Amelia, unable to contain her frustration any longer, spoke up, her voice sharp. "Other passengers? You mean passengers who look more like they belong in first class?" The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Nearby passengers began to take notice, some watching with rapt attention, others averting their eyes in discomfort. Marcus placed a calming hand on Amelia's arm, even as his own anger began to boil. He knew this look, this feeling, the feeling of being treated as if they didn't belong. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with steel, "we have valid tickets for these seats. We will not be moved. If there's an overbooking issue, I suggest you find another solution that doesn't involve discriminating against paying customers." The cabin was silent for a moment, the tension in the air thickening. The children, sensing the change in atmosphere, looked to their parents with confusion and concern. Their joy seemed to evaporate, replaced by the confusion of a situation they didn't understand. But just as the confrontation seemed poised to escalate, a voice rang out from a few rows ahead. "Excuse me, what seems to be the problem here?" All eyes turned toward the source of the interruption, and it didn't take long for the passengers to recognize the man standing in the aisle. It was James Hartley. A voice for justice. As the passengers in the cabin turned toward the voice that had interrupted the escalating tension, a collective murmur of recognition rippled through the plane. It was James Hartley, the renowned actor known not just for his box office hits, but also for his outspoken advocacy on issues of social justice. His mere presence seemed to command attention, an aura of confidence, conviction, and purpose. The celebrity stood there, in the aisle, dressed casually in a simple yet stylish pair of jeans and a fitted t-shirt, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding before him. Amelia blinked in surprise, her thoughts momentarily lost. She had seen Hartley on television, in films, and had admired his courage in speaking out about important causes. But now, here he was, standing up for them. James Hartley didn't hesitate. His voice, calm yet undeniably firm, sliced through the growing tension in the cabin. "I couldn't help but overhear," he began, his words measured but laced with authority. "Are you asking this family to move from their assigned seats?" The head attendant, Mr. Dawson, visibly flustered, stammered in response, clearly caught off guard by the presence of the actor. "Mr. Hartley, I assure you, this is just a matter of overbooking," he said, his voice rising slightly in an attempt to regain control. "Overbooking?" Hartley interrupted, his expression hardening. "You're telling me that this family, who has paid for these seats months ago, should be removed because of overbooking?" He shook his head, his face reflecting disbelief. No, this isn't an overbooking issue. This is something else." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as Hartley's words echoed through the space. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to handle the situation with such a high-profile figure intervening. But Hartley's resolve only deepened. He wasn't just a celebrity, he was a person who cared deeply about justice, about equality, and about the responsibility that came with having a platform. Looking directly at Mr. Dawson, Hartley continued, his voice unwavering. "From where I'm standing, it looks like blatant discrimination. You're telling this family, who has every right to be here, to move simply because of how they look. You're telling them they don't belong in a space they've rightfully paid for." A murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Some of them began to shift in their seats, uncomfortable with the tension, while others, more aware of what was happening, began to nod in quiet agreement with Hartley. The truth of his words settled over the cabin like a weight, and the collective discomfort that had been growing in the room suddenly felt palpable. Marcus watched this all unfold, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief in his chest. This wasn't how he had imagined the start of their dream vacation. He had envisioned a smooth flight, an easy journey to the Bahamas with his family, not an encounter like this. But in this moment, something shifted within him. The presence of James Hartley, the man who had chosen to step into this situation, to speak up for them, was a beacon of hope. It was a reminder that even when faced with adversity, there were still people willing to stand up and fight for what was right. The head attendant, visibly shaken, seemed to be searching for words. "Mr. Hartley, with all due respect, this is an internal airline matter," he said, his voice wavering as he tried to maintain some semblance of authority. "We don't need outside interference." "This isn't about your internal matter," Hartley replied, cutting him off with the quiet force of a person who had made up his mind. "This is a human rights matter. And it's one that concerns every single person on this plane." A hush fell over the cabin. The power in Hartley's words was undeniable. It wasn't just a celebrity speaking, it was a human being calling out injustice. And suddenly, the passengers who had been hesitant, unsure of how to react, began to stir. They looked around, exchanged uncertain glances, but many of them were beginning to see the truth of what was happening. Hartley didn't stop there. He turned his attention to the other passengers, his voice rising just enough to capture everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his eyes sweeping over the cabin, making eye contact with several of them, "we're witnessing a moment here, a moment that demands our attention and, frankly, our action. It's 2024, and it's unacceptable that a family should face discrimination simply because of the color of their skin. It's unacceptable that people who have paid for a service, who have done nothing wrong, are being treated like this." The cabin buzzed with murmurs of agreement. Some passengers nodded, their discomfort with the situation turning into support. Others, more vocal, began to speak up. Exactly, an older woman a few rows back called out. What's the problem? They've paid for their seats. They have every right to stay where they are. Yes, let them stay, a man shouted from the other side of the cabin. This is ridiculous. The tide of public opinion in the cabin shifted rapidly. What had begun as a tense standoff between the Johnsons and the flight attendants was quickly becoming a larger issue, a matter of principle, a question of right and wrong. The passengers, many of whom had previously been silent or simply uncomfortable, now began to voice their support for the Johnson family. Marcus felt a flicker of hope rise within him. He had always believed in standing up for what was right, in fighting for fairness, but seeing the support from total strangers, people who had no obligation to intervene but chose to, was something truly extraordinary. It was a reminder that even in the face of adversity, people could come together and make a difference. He stood up, his voice steady and calm but filled with the weight of what had happened and what was still happening. We don't want to cause a scene, Marcus said, his gaze sweeping over the growing crowd of supporters. We just want to enjoy our vacation, the one we've worked so hard for. Is that too much to ask? His words seemed to resonate deeply with those who had been listening. The elderly woman who had spoken earlier stood up in her seat, raising her hand in support. They've done nothing wrong, she called out, her voice rising in solidarity. This is their right. More voices joined in. Don't move them, another passenger shouted. They've paid for those seats. The support for the Johnson family grew louder, more unified, until it became impossible to ignore. The head attendant, Mr. Dawson, stood frozen, his face flushed with embarrassment as he realized that the situation had spiraled beyond his control. He looked helplessly from the Johnsons to James Hartley, then to the sea of disapproving faces surrounding them. It was clear now that forcing the Johnsons to move would only escalate the situation further. With a defeated sigh, Mr. Dawson finally turned to the Johnsons. His voice was quiet, strained. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, on behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding. Of course, you and your children are welcome to remain in your assigned seats. The tension in the cabin seemed to dissipate all at once. A collective exhale rippled through the passengers as they relaxed into their seats. Some of them even smiled at the Johnsons, offering them soft applause, as if they, too, had witnessed something important unfold. Marcus exchanged a look with Amelia. For a moment, there were no words, just the shared understanding that they had been supported, not just by a celebrity, but by a room full of people who believed in doing what was right. Hartley, satisfied with the outcome, gave Marcus a respectful nod before returning to his seat. As he walked past, several passengers reached out to shake his hand, their gratitude evident in their eyes. James Hartley had done more than just intervene, he had reminded them all that sometimes, standing up for what's right is the most important thing anyone can do. The Johnson family settled back into their seats, the excitement of the journey returning now that the tension had lifted. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Marcus smiled to himself. They had faced adversity, and yet, with the help of unexpected allies, they had overcome it. They were going to the Bahamas, and nothing, could take that away. Standing strong in the face of adversity. The Johnson family's journey seemed to settle into an uneasy calm as the plane began its taxi down the runway. Amelia leaned back in her seat, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over her. Her mind was still processing the events that had unfolded. What had started as a dream vacation had suddenly turned into a public confrontation over something she never thought would happen, discrimination in a space that should have been welcoming. Her fingers gripped Marcus's hand, as though seeking some anchor, something solid in the chaos of emotion swirling in her chest. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and calm, a silent assurance that everything would be okay. But even as the engines roared to life and the plane lifted into the sky, Amelia couldn't quite shake the feeling of discomfort, the knowledge that they had been treated differently, simply because of the way they looked. But the tension in the cabin had shifted. No longer were they alone in this battle. The people around them, the other passengers who had watched the scene unfold, had stepped forward in support. Amelia could feel their collective energy, the silent agreement that what had happened wasn't right. She couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward those who had spoken up, particularly James Hartley, whose words had been the catalyst for a change that might not have otherwise occurred. The flight attendants, now more subdued, seemed to avoid making eye contact with the Johnsons. They moved up and down the aisles, attending to other passengers, their faces etched with the kind of regret that comes from realizing that their actions were wrong. Amelia couldn't help but wonder how they would have handled the situation had Hartley not intervened. Would they have forced them out of their seats? Would they have ignored the voices rising in their defense? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice from beside her. It was Tyler, her youngest son, who had been unusually quiet since the confrontation. He was staring out the window, his small face reflecting a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "Mom," he said softly, "why did they want to make us leave?" Amelia's heart broke at the innocence in his voice. How could she explain to her 9-year-old son that the world wasn't always fair? How could she tell him that sometimes, people would judge them for things beyond their control, things as simple as the color of their skin? She had spent so many years protecting her children from these harsh truths, but now, in this moment, there was no escaping it. She turned to him, her voice gentle, but firm. "Sometimes, baby," she began, her words carefully chosen, "people make mistakes. They might not understand how hurtful their actions are. But what matters is that we know who we are, and we know what's right. And we don't let anyone take that from us." Tyler looked up at her with wide eyes, absorbing her words. "But they were wrong, right?" Amelia smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Yes, sweetheart. They were wrong. But the good news is that there are more people who are willing to stand up for what's right. People like Mr. Hartley, who didn't hesitate to say something when he saw that we were being treated unfairly." Tyler nodded slowly, his brow furrowed in thought. "And we get to stay in our seats now, right?" "Yes, we do," Amelia replied, her voice soft but resolute. "And we'll enjoy the rest of our flight, just like we deserve to." Marcus, sitting on the other side of the aisle, overheard their conversation and couldn't help but feel a swell of emotion. He had worked so hard to give his family the life they deserved, to create memories that they could cherish forever. And here they were, facing something he never imagined, a battle for dignity, for respect. But now, as they spoke about it, he realized something important: they had won. Not in the way they expected, not without a fight, but they had won nonetheless. As the plane cruised through the skies, Marcus found himself thinking about the future. What kind of world were they raising their children in? How many more moments like this would they have to endure? And how could he, as a father, protect them from such injustices while also preparing them to face them head-on? He thought of the many lessons he had taught Zoe and Tyler: work hard, be kind, stand up for what's right. Today, those lessons had come to life in a way that was more real, more powerful, than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about fighting the system, it was about fighting for each other. It was about showing his children that their voice mattered, that they had a right to stand up for themselves, and that there would always be people who would fight with them, not just for them. Meanwhile, Amelia couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts happening around them. She glanced across the aisle at the other passengers, and she saw something that made her heart flutter: understanding. They were no longer just observers, they had become participants in this moment, and many of them were now actively engaging with the situation. Some were nodding, others were quietly speaking to one another. The cabin had become a space where support and unity had replaced discomfort and suspicion. Zoe, who had been quiet for the past few minutes, suddenly leaned forward, her voice full of wonder. "Mom, do you think we're going to be famous now, because Mr. Hartley helped us?" Amelia chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "I don't know, baby. But I do know that what we did today, what Mr. Hartley did, wasn't about being famous. It was about standing up for what's right. And that's something that's always worth fighting for." Zoe seemed satisfied with the answer, her eyes lighting up with a newfound sense of pride. She turned her attention back to the window, her face full of wonder as the clouds parted, revealing the vast expanse of ocean below them. Marcus, watching his family, felt something shift inside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. Despite everything that had happened, they were still a family, strong, united, and ready for whatever lay ahead. And as the flight continued toward the Bahamas, he knew that this trip would become a story they would tell for years to come, a story not just of vacation, but of resilience and the power of standing together. The plane's announcement about the descent to their destination jolted the family from their thoughts. As the aircraft began its gradual descent toward the turquoise waters of the Bahamas, Marcus looked around the cabin, grateful for the support they had received but also mindful of the lessons this experience had taught him. It wasn't just about the destination, it was about the journey, the lessons learned, the people who stood by them, and the strength they had found in one another. As the plane touched down, a sense of accomplishment settled over the family. They were finally here, but more importantly, they had faced down adversity and emerged stronger. And they knew, deep down, that no matter where they went from here, nothing would ever change the fact that they had earned their place in the world. And that, above all else, was worth more than any first-class seat. A new beginning. As the plane touched down in the Bahamas, Johnson family couldn't help but feel a wave of mixed emotions. The initial excitement of the vacation had faded somewhat, replaced by a deeper, more contemplative mood. What should have been a peaceful, fun-filled journey had unexpectedly become a chapter in their lives, one that they would never forget. But despite the conflict, the family knew that they had emerged stronger than ever, both as individuals and as a unit. They had faced adversity head-on, with grace and courage, and had overcome it, not just for themselves, but for others as well. When the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, the usual bustle of passengers disembarking ensued. The Johnsons stood up, gathering their belongings, feeling the weight of the day's events. But as they moved toward the exit, they were met with something unexpected. Several passengers, the ones who had been part of the silent support during the confrontation, turned toward them as they passed. One by one, people stopped to offer kind words, smiles, and even handshakes. An elderly woman who had been seated a few rows behind them caught Marcus's eye as he walked down the aisle. "You handled that with so much dignity," she said warmly, her voice thick with emotion. "You're an inspiration to all of us." Her words, simple yet powerful, struck Marcus to his core. He nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you," he managed, his voice thick. It wasn't just her words, there was something about the way she had said it, the sincerity in her eyes, that made him realize just how significant this moment had been. It wasn't just about the fight for a seat, it was about standing up for each other, showing the world that people would not sit idly by when injustice reared its ugly head. The Johnsons finally exited the plane and made their way toward the terminal, where a surge of warmth enveloped them. The bright Bahamian sun shone down, casting a golden glow over the tropical paradise they had long dreamed of. It was hard to reconcile the beauty of the place with the memory of the conflict they had just endured. But as they walked together through the airport, surrounded by the sounds of vacationers in various stages of excitement, the family found a renewed sense of strength. The experience had not broken them, it had forged something in them that would last far beyond this trip. They collected their luggage and made their way to the transport that would take them to their resort. It was a beautiful place, a far cry from the tension-filled flight they had just endured. The turquoise water stretched as far as the eye could see, the white sand pristine and inviting. Marcus and Amelia exchanged a look, silently acknowledging the emotional weight of the past few hours, and then turning their focus to the future. "This is what we've worked for," Marcus said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "This is what we deserve." Amelia smiled, her hand brushing against his. "And we're going to make the most of it. Every single moment." The children, their spirits once again lifted by the beauty surrounding them, ran ahead toward the beach, their laughter echoing through the air. For a brief moment, the Johnsons allowed themselves to forget everything that had happened. The past was behind them, and they were here, in this paradise, ready to create new memories, memories that would be far more important than any injustice they had faced. but deep down, they knew they couldn't forget what had happened. It had left its mark, a mark that was both painful and necessary. The fight they had faced was one that was all too familiar for people of color, especially in spaces that were supposed to be inclusive and welcoming. It was a stark reminder that despite the progress that had been made, there was still work to be done. The world was not yet perfect, and the Johnsons understood that better than most. As they settled into their resort, enjoying the luxuries they had earned, the family made a pact. They would use their story as a tool, not for pity, but for progress. They would speak out when they saw injustice. They would never shy away from the fight for dignity, equality, and respect. Their vacation had already been unforgettable, not because of the destination, but because of what they had learned about themselves, about each other, and about the world. And Marcus had made a quiet promise to himself. He would not just be the provider for his family. He would be their protector in a way that went beyond financial security. He would teach his children to stand up for themselves and for others, to never allow anyone to strip away their humanity. He would teach them that being kind didn't mean being passive, and that the true strength came not in the ability to avoid confrontation, but in the courage to face it head-on and demand better for everyone. In the weeks that followed, Marcus and Amelia became more involved in social justice causes, their experience on the plane driving them to take action. They spoke at local schools, sharing their story with others, particularly young people who might have felt marginalized or excluded. They advocated for better policies in corporations and institutions, using their voices to amplify the message that change was possible and necessary. And as for Zoe and Tyler, the lessons they had learned were profound. They understood, at a young age, the value of their voice and the importance of standing up for what was right. They understood that sometimes the world would try to make them feel small, but that they could never allow themselves to be silenced. They learned the power of empathy, of being allies to others who faced struggles that were different from their own. They grew not only in knowledge but in wisdom, understanding that while they might not be able to change everything, they could change their corner of the world, one act of kindness and justice at a time. By the end of the trip, the Johnsons had experienced more than they could have ever imagined. The memories of the confrontation on the plane became less of a painful reminder and more of a turning point, a moment where they chose to rise above adversity and take control of their narrative. It wasn't just about a vacation. It was about understanding the depth of their own strength, their power to create change, and their ability to rise, even in the face of injustice. As they boarded their return flight, this time without incident, Marcus looked around at his family. They were tired, yes, but they were also stronger. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep, unshakable peace. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, no doubt, but he knew that together, they could face anything. They had already shown that. This family, this incredible family, was unbreakable. And no matter where life took them next, they knew that nothing could take away their sense of worth, their dignity, or their ability to stand up for what was right. The end of one journey was simply the beginning of another. And the Johnsons were ready.